Hello and welcome to Carlson Software's series of Thursday webinars. This is actually a re-recording of the webinar we recorded earlier today. My name is David Sanford and I am the South Central United States Regional Sales Director for Carlson Software. Today's webinar is presented by Paul Carlson, President and Founder of Carlson Desktop Solutions. CDS has been one of Carlson Software's top resellers since they began business back in 2007. Paul is a founding member of our Carlson College. Paul has over 10 years of experience as a trainer and over 7 years of experience with SurvCE. Today's webinar will be an overview of SurvCE for GPS. Paul will explore some of the new features contained within SurvCE 2.5 for GPS. SurvCE 2.5, by the way, is a free upgrade for SurvCE 2.0 users. If you're a user of SurvCE and have an earlier version, you can also upgrade your SurvCE to SurvCE 2.5 very inexpensively. If you have the GPS module, it's $4.95. Again, this is not intended to be an advanced class on SurvCE. It is intended to be a demonstration of an overview of SurvCE for GPS. Paul's company is Carlson Desktop Solutions. You can see his number there. He's available at 512-335-4018. I invite you to visit his website at www.carlsonds, as in desktop.com. And if you have any questions after today's webinar, please feel free to email Paul or myself at the emails listed below. And now I'm pleased to present Paul Carlson of Carlson Desktop Solutions.
Dave, thank you. I'd like to reiterate a couple things that Dave hit on there. Number one, feel free to contact us to any questions, anything we can do at all. That's what we're here for. I'd also like to point out on our website you'll find a couple of pieces of information. Number one being the knowledge base. Second piece of information is our blog. Both of those contain all kinds of videos and documentation we've put out there for clients, things that we feel are helpful based on questions and feedback we get from companies we deal with. There should also be a link on the homepage for subscribing to our monthly newsletter. Newsletter comes out once a month. I don't hit you with it twice a week or every afternoon. It comes out once a month. It's full of industry news, tips, tricks, and every month we've recently started adding a bad joke, so there's always a bad joke in there as well. So with that, what I'll do is I'll go ahead and bring SurvCE up here. Now, what you're looking at is my SurvCE screen. This is on my Allegro connected to my GPS receiver. I'm currently running SurvCE version 2.5.25, which is an engineering or a beta build. This was provided to me to do some testing and provide some feedback to Carlson's programmers on some things that this build addresses. So this is version 2.5.25. Now, what I encourage you to do is on your data collector, go to the equipment menu, go to About SurvCE. The top of the screen, it shows you the version and the build date of that. If you are running anything that says SurvCE 1 point anything, it doesn't matter which version, if it says 1 dot, any 1 point version can be upgraded to a 2 point version, ranging anywhere from $295 to $495 depending on what options you have. GPS, for example, is a $495 upgrade to go from a 1.0 to a 2.0 version. 2.5 is a free upgrade for any 2.0 users. So if you are 2.03, 2.5 is a free upgrade for you. I definitely encourage you to go get that, especially if you're using it with GPS. Okay, there are a lot of things that we'll cover and touch on today that are perfect examples of these things that have been added, changed, updated, fixed, made better inside of SurvCE 2.5. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started here. Now, there are obviously two ways to work with the GPS, actually 3 ways. There's always static type position, but the common 2 ways are either using a base and rover, typically using some kind of radio connection, spread spectrum radios, UHF radios, large 35 watt pack crest type radios, things like that, or using a single rover with a GSM connection to a reference network and going. I'm going to hit on both of these as best I can. I have one receiver set up here that I'm connected to, so I'm not going to do everything in the base rover, but I want to hit a couple things that are important, or things that are typically questions that I receive. So where I'm going to begin is on the equipment menu under GPS base. I'm going to be connecting to an Altus APS-3 receiver. I'm going to be connecting on a Bluetooth connection, and I'll go ahead and tell it to connect Bluetooth device. My data collector will establish a connection. I get the message that says, hey, you've established the connection, now we're communicating. One piece of information I want to point out that some of the receivers have, if I want to really check that communication, back here under the current tab, there's a block with an I, that's for information. In this case, because I'm connected to an Altus receiver, the information that's given back to me is the firmware version, the receiver ID, and then the battery information. Okay, so I can get an idea here how much battery life I have remaining. Under the receiver tab, I have the ability to select the antenna type. Now, in older versions of SurvCE, really all you had here was the ability to put an antenna height. There were very few options. Over the years, some of these things have been added in. In 2.5, you really have more options added, including the ability to come in here and enter custom antenna types and information. Okay, but for the most part, everything you're going to use is set up in here and ready to go. Okay, under the RTK tab, the type of connection, I'm first going to connect using the internal radio, and I'm going to do a RTCM 2.3 message type. Nothing fancy here. Really what I'm looking for is this next step. Everything we've done so far, for the most part, has been in SurvCE, a couple of changes. What I'm really interested in is this next step. Not because it's so new, but because this seems to be the #1 spot people get hung up or confused. When we reach the screen, SurvCE says, all right, what do you want to do? You're telling me you're a base. What are you going to do here? And I have two options. I can either start a new position with no known information, or I can go from a known position. Now, this terminology and what actually is happening here is somewhat confusing, and it has been for a long time, because technically entering a latitude, longitude, or entering a grid system is known information. It's something I have that somebody's given me. I'm inputting it. That terminology tends to trip people up. Basically, the way I look at this is, from new position means this is something I have not surveyed. Known position means I have surveyed this, I have the data for it. Okay, so if I wanted to say start from 9727 or whatever latitude, longitude, I could key that in. Same thing with state plane value. Or under known position, I can pick a previously surveyed point from my raw file. I can use local coordinates, or I can read it from the DAT file. When all of this is done, I can save that DAT file, and I can use that file over and over again. Okay. What I want to do is I want to do a here position. Simply take my current location, do a reading, store it, and let me go from this position. So I'll tell it to read from GPS, and I'll tell it to do simply 5 readings. Okay. You have a GPS monitor, it takes you to monitor SkyPlot. We're going to go into monitor SkyPlot, so I'm not going to go into it here. But I'll tell it to take 5 readings. Okay. We've received our readings, and now this looks a little bit different from what we're used to seeing from SurvCE. Same information being displayed, just in a different format. Okay, I'll go ahead and OK that, and then I'm asked to save this base configuration file and to assign a base ID. Now the base ID comes into play. Let's say I'm doing a 10-mile road project, and I don't want to move a base, every afternoon as I go. So maybe I set up control along the project, and I set different bases up along the project so I can have people working in different areas at different times. If I'm setting up multiple bases, I can give each base a broadcast ID, and then when I go to the rover, instead of telling it to just find the nearest base, I can tell it to go to this specific base ID. If I am not doing multiple bases, do not enter a broadcast ID. I've seen this happen with people that will enter a broadcast ID here, call it number 1. They'll go to the rover and they'll say, look for, don't look for anything. And it'll say there's no base. We're not getting corrections. So unless you're doing multiple bases simultaneously running along a project, I would leave this blank. With that blank, continue with the setup. Yes. And then it's going to come up and ask me if I would like to save this file. And that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to save this for later use. By default, it uses the same name as the project. So what all my other files are, that's what this is going to be. If you are going to move your base, say 3 or 4 times throughout a day, and you wish to store those as individuals, you could change the name, position 1, position 2, position 3, or point number 1, point number 15, point number 27. I have the ability to store that or customize that name to fit my needs. Okay, I'm going to store it with the basic information and then move on from there. Now, again, I'm not going to connect another base. Really no need to. The connection settings for the rover are pretty much the same. The key here is to make sure that my settings match. If I'm using a CMR message type on the base, I want to use CMR on the rover. I don't want an RTCM3 and an RTCM2 trying to communicate. It's just not going to happen. So we verify those settings. The basic procedure is the same here, whether we're on either device. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to configure the GPS rover. Again, I'm going to verify that I'm using the Altus APS-3. Bluetooth connected to that receiver. I'll click the bond with Bluetooth. We have a successful connection. My receiver option, same information here, my antenna height, the elevation mast. Now what we have here that's not been here before, and this covers most of the manufacturers out there, not all of them, but a lot of the manufacturers are out there, Leica, Topcon, Altus, so on and so forth. Some of these receivers have this ability to store the vector data in the raw file. So inside of the SurvCE file, in the RW5 file, you're actually going to see those raw vectors stored in. And essentially what that looks like, I have a file from a client. Get this thing open here. So what we see, this is our traditional raw file, and what we see is we have a little note that is our vector information. A couple of pieces of information to point out. Number 1, here's the date and the GPS clock time that this position was started. It gives me the base information, which base I'm connected to, and then it gives me the deltas for the X, Y, and Z for the base position. So the delta from the base to the rover is displayed here. Now there's other information there about the geodetic position, but that's all stored in that raw file. If I wanted to do anything with that, if I wanted to process that information or do anything with it, I would use a program. For example, if it's a Leica receiver, Leica Geomatic Office, Trimble, TGO, so on and so forth, those manufacturers typically have a product. I believe Carlson is working on...
Yes, that's correct, Paul. Carlson Software is putting together a GNSS software. That is something that's in the works and will be available soon.
So that covers your other products like Sokia and Novotel and even the Carlson Surveyor with the GPS pack on it. That'll give you answers for those. Outside of that, probably the best third party I've seen is from a Canadian company called OnPause, and the product is called EasySurv. That's a good option if you're not using TGO or LGO, but those vectors or any kind of static processing or post-processing would be done through those products. This is simply how SurvCE stores that inside the raw file. So that's what the store vectors and raw data does. This is a new option. To me, it's kind of like having your angles and distances in your raw file from your total station. Instead of simply saying, woohoo, here's my latitude, longitude, great, I actually have something I can post-process against, and I can actually use those measurements to recreate all of the survey data from the base position. So the raw vector is a nice thing that they added in. I know a lot of people have asked for it for a long time, and it was really nice to see it in the 2.0 releases of SurvCE. Under the RTK tab, again, I tell it which type of device I'm using, internal GSM, external GSM, Airlink modems, PAC-Crest modems, Wavecomms, data collector internet. Again, if I'm using the Carlson SurvCE with the GPS pack, I would tell it to use the data collector internet. Use the SIM card that's built into the data collector. There are other data collectors that come with that internal card as well. So you have a lot of options available to you for communication here. In my case, I'm going to use an internal GSM. I'm going to use an in-trip connection and connect to the Leica smart network here in Texas. I can configure this by clicking on the little tools to the right. Give it my information, the name of the network or create new one, the IP address, port, username and password. Tell it to OK that. I'll establish a connection to the modem. It'll connect to the network. Download my base information, and then allow me to begin working. This process takes a couple of seconds to do, but the amount of time the reference network saves over a base rover is almost immeasurable. Okay, and then again I tell it which type of corrections I want coming off of the base. I'm going to use an RTCM2 nearest, which means it'll go to the nearest base and give me a single baseline correction. If I wanted, I could do the max solutions, which is a true network-based correction. Once I have everything set, I hit the green check mark, OK. And we've got communication going to the rover. There's information going to the network. And we should be ready to rock and roll here in just a second. Now, my first step, once I've established that connection, before I go anywhere, if I'm using base rover, I've seen this time and time and time again. Somebody will set up the base, they'll get in the truck and they'll drive, half a mile away from the base. They'll set up the rover and they got no communication. Don't do that. Before you get going, set up the rover while you're close to the base so you can connect back to the base and verify information or do anything you need to do. The same thing with the rover on a network. Before I go on, I want to check the information that's happening here. So I'm going to go to Monitor SkyPlot. Now, a couple of reasons for going to Monitor SkyPlot. One, this is where I go to check. And two, in this case, there's some things that they added in SurvCE that are really, really nice and really, really helpful that I want to point out. The very first thing I'm going to look at is that I am fixed. My latency, the number of satellites, and the elevation. If I ever am not fixed, if I'm float, autonomous, DGPS, WAS, any other message here, I want to come in and look at Monitor SkyPlot. I want to see what's happening. So I can see that I have plenty of satellite coverage. I can see the local coordinate values. And then I see all my DOP values, my horizontal, my T, my GDOP, and below that, my standard deviations. Now, if you're using an older version of SurvCE, this is going to look different. In the previous versions of SurvCE, this was registered as horizontal and vertical RMS values, the horizontal and vertical residual values. Now we're looking at standard deviations, SDV, horizontal standard deviation, and a vertical standard deviation. Okay, change in terminology is simply what we're looking at. But I know the first time I saw it, I panicked because I didn't know if I had checked something that's supposed to be there. The other thing you'll see that you haven't seen in the past, the GPS clock time. Okay, so instead of just relying on the latency to tell me what's happening, I can look at the GPS clock time and see if I'm at least communicating with my rover. The other option here, or the other important thing to bring up, is the Reset RTK button. Years and years ago, the first time I picked up a GPS receiver, we went out on a site, started surveying, we got in a bad area we couldn't fix, so we floated, we waited a while, it never came out of float. So the first thing you did is you turn the receiver upside down. You dunked the receiver to let it clear out that position and start over, essentially. What really happened is the position didn't completely clear out. There was bad information, or could potentially be bad information left over in that position, multipath and other things. Reset RTK does essentially that same thing in that it tells the position to start over, forget what we just did. But the big difference is doing it here makes a clean cut. So instead of saying, well, we'll dunk it and flip it and hope that there's nothing bad in there, using Reset RTK completely clears out that previous record and starts fresh. So this was a phenomenal addition by Carlson to add that in, at least in my opinion. Under the Position tab, I can see my current position. If I had a geoid loaded, I would see the geoid file name, and I would see the orthometric height or orthometric elevation, and if I had a localization, I could see that that was being applied as well. Under the satellite view, one of the very first things we see here is a big yellow circle. Big yellow circle is kind of hidden now by my satellites, but over here to the left of the screen there's a yellow circle. That is a sun position. Okay? Sun position can be turned on and off depending on if you want to see it or not. The other thing that's in here are my satellites. Red satellites in my case are GPS, green are SPAS, and blue are my GLONASS. To the right, I can see all the signal-to-noise ratio values for each of the satellites, and I can see here and on the left which ones are being used. If they have a slash through them, they are not being used. Okay? What I notice here is that I have a bunch of GLONASS satellites with X's through them. Now, I'm connected to the network. My GPS receiver is GLONASS capable. Why am I not getting those GLONASS? Well, in order to receive GLONASS, both the base and the rover have to be able to receive those GLONASS satellite data. In this case, the base I'm connected to on the network is not GLONASS capable. So because my receiver is, if that base is not, I will not take advantage or get to use those GLONASS satellites. I can turn on and off the satellites individually by simply clicking on one. Here's that satellite, the information for it, and I can tell it to enable or disable it. I can also click anywhere out here to the side of it on the open space, and now I can see a complete list of all the satellites, so I can turn things on and off as I wish, as well as the setting for my sun position. If I uncheck the sun display enabled, I won't see that solar position. Okay. The satellite information, again, more information, detailed information about my satellites, what type of satellite it is, the elevation, the signal-to-noise ratio, etc. The last tab is one that I think is often overlooked by people, and this is probably one of the most important or one of the best tabs in here to use. And this is the reference. This is my information for my base. Okay. If I'm on a network and I'm floating for 2 or 3 minutes and I don't fix, I want to come look at my distance to base, because maybe I'm 38 miles away from the base. Chances are I could sit there for a week and not get a fix at that distance. Okay, the baseline is just too long. So I want to come in here and I want to see that distance. Now, one of the nice things I've seen here over the last few releases is that this actually shows in miles. Earlier releases of SurvCE showed it in feet, so you always had to do the quick 5280 divided by. So this is a little bit nicer here. This was one change that was made. Okay, if I come here and there's no base information, that means I'm not talking to the network. Or if I'm running base rover using radios, I'm not talking to my base. So this is a good indicator to me that there's no communication happening between my rover and the base from where I'm trying to get corrections. I also have the ability here to store that base position. So if I click store, wherever that base is, that point will be stored. Comes up just like a regular store point. I have the option to give it a point number and save it. Two other sections here that I guess we overlook sometimes or don't take full advantage of. One, the GPS utilities. The biggest feature in the GPS utilities, different receivers are going to look a little bit different here because this is specific to each manufacturer. So some of them will have more options, some of them will have less, but they all should have the network disconnect. When you're using the radios, not such a big deal, but when you're connected to a network, you've basically picked up the phone, you've dialed, you've made a phone call. Before I just shut everything off, I want to hang that phone up. Okay, I want to make a good, clean disconnect. So I'm going to come in and say network disconnect. Okay, that's probably the biggest one. The reset RTK, this is the same thing in monitor skyplot. It's a little redundancy, but you know, hey, it's there if you need or want it in both places. Okay. The other thing here is the localization. Now this is going to look a little bit different from what you're used to seeing in older versions of SurvCE. For example, I have the ability to go ahead and set my projection. Same thing we see under the file, under the job settings. Same stuff that's there. I have the ability to load a predefined or create a custom projection. And then my GPS settings, the localization method. How is it going to handle the localization? If I remember correctly from the early versions of SurvCE, this also was under the job settings and not tied in with the localization. So you really didn't see these things side by side. Okay, so you would come over to localize, you would set up your localization and then go, well, did I have a rigid body or plain similarity? I forgot how I did it. Now I got to go back to job settings and look and find it. And it wasn't very well meshed with you know how it is now. It's more fluid now. The same thing is true with the scale factor. Being able to plug in the scale factor here again was in a different place and you had to bounce around between things to get it. Now it's all here in one spot. Very well organized. It's a good feature in SurvCE 2.0 and then even in the 2.5. You have the ability here to key in your scale factor. You have the ability to read from the GPS position and have it calculate a scale factor, or you have a calculator which will let you calculate your scale factor. Okay, and because I'm using GPS, this was always a point of confusion for people. Which way am I going? Is it grid to ground? How do I enter it? They kind of cleaned this up a little bit too and said if you're using GPS, we're going from the grid to the ground. Okay. So my scale factors, and then my points, this is where I actually do my localization. This is really no different from what we've always seen. I would go in and add my point number, take my number of readings, and then I can turn the positions on or off, turning on horizontal location or vertical. So I could have 15 localization points. 5 of these I want to use for horizontal, and 5 of them I want to use for vertical. Okay, so I can turn things on and off as I need. No real difference there. Okay, I'm going to go into the configure and I'm going to turn a setting on or make sure I have a couple of settings on. Number 1, the store fixed only. This is an absolute must. I've taken a couple calls over the years from somebody that said, hey, my guy shot these property corners and they're not right. Or they shot these manholes and they're not right at all. They're in the wrong spot. It's all wrong. And what happened is somebody came in here and told it to, hey, I don't care if the point's fixed or not. Let's store it. Now, it does warn me. It does say, hey, this is not fixed. You want to do this. But I recommend, you know what, that should be turned on. Store fixed only. I'm going to tell it to prompt for height and description. That's just something I want to see when I store the point. I want it to come up and prompt me for that. It's just how I choose to see it. So I just want to verify that that thing is on, and I'll hit OK. I'll go in the survey menu and I'll tell it to store points. Not a lot's changed here. Pretty much the same stuff we're used to seeing. I see in the upper left-hand corner, I'm fixed. I see my number of satellites, my standard deviations at the bottom. Over on the bottom right-hand side, I have the ability to look at my monitor sky plot. So if in the upper left-hand corner, if it goes away from fixed, it says float or it says autonomous, this is my first course of action. I click on the monitor sky plot. I come look at the information, look at the quality, look at the reference, see how far I am from the base. I reset RTK, see what happens, and then I go back in and proceed. Store points hasn't changed a whole lot. I tell it to store. Call it a natural ground, and I'll hit OK. One of the things I want to bring up here is the field to finish, and I want to bring that up. I want to go back to that. That kind of brings that up nicely. I want to go over here to File, Feature Code List. If you are using the Carlson Survey Office products and you've put the 2010 version on, you're going to look at field to finish and go, wow, this is different. Okay, they changed it. They added a lot of really great stuff and cleaned up what was there. That rolled over to SurvCE as well. One of the things that they've added, for example, are categories. Okay, so I can group things together in categories a little differently than I did in the past. And then in the Office, if I had categories, they didn't transfer. So this is a little cleaner, a little nicer. Something extra you have here is the categories. My recommendation for field to finish is still go to the Office, set it up inside the Office, and transfer to SurvCE. Trying to sit in the truck using the little keyboard on the data collector to create a code library, not the way I would go. Okay, that's just me. I guess if you get paid by the hour, though, it's that's the way to do it. Going back under survey and the store points, the biggest change I want to bring up here, this is the biggest and probably one of the most important changes, it's the average function. In the past, when you said do an average, if you said average 5 readings, it would take 5 readings and then it would average those readings together. So if only 3 out of the 5 were valid, hey, that's what you got an average of. Well, I don't want that. If I say I want 5 readings, by George, I want 5 readings. So I want you to keep going until you get 5 good readings. And if it takes me 30 minutes, that's fine. I'm going to sit here until I get 5. So that's what my only increment does. If I turn that on, it's only going to use or only going to advance when it has a good reading. I can tell it to beep on rejected readings. The data collector beeps at me enough because I'm not the brightest bulb in the box sometimes, and I've got fat fingers and I push buttons I shouldn't push, and I get beeped at all the time. And if you've used the Stakeout GPS, you're getting yelled at by the receiver too. So this is your preference, but I think I get beeped at enough, so I don't turn that on. And then the log average observations, basically put all this information in the raw file for me above and beyond what's already going there. Okay, my tolerances, it was nice that this is added here instead of just under the configure. These are my horizontal and vertical standard deviation tolerances, and the stakeout tolerances added as well. So that's the minimum requirement it's looking at to average the points. So I'll go ahead and tell it to do the average, and it's taking reading 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We can see that every one of these are valid. If it had gotten an invalid one, it would have taken the next reading and the next one until it got a valid reading. So it proceeds, gives me the report. Again, a little bit different report format, but I like what we're seeing here. NG average. I just want to make sure I know that that was an averaged position. Okay, so that's how I would do my point averaging, and like I said, that's probably one of the biggest things that's been added into this, and in my opinion, one of the more important things that have been added into 2.5, at least for for me. Okay, so those are the biggest things that I see. There are other things. Is the instrument level? I don't know. I have that option on here, but like my total stations and things, I can go in and make sure that if my instrument has dual axis compensator, has the level bubble digitally, I could see that. Log raw GPS, some receivers have the ability to log static. For example, the receiver I'm using has the ability to log the static data into the receiver itself, and that would be my status. So those are the big things that I wanted to hit on. Those are the important things. There's so much more that can be covered. An hour is tough to squeeze everything in, but we got in quite a bit of information. And I guess what I'd like to do now is go ahead and open up to any questions that we have. Anything else we need to cover?
Yes, Paul, we did receive a few questions from today's earlier broadcast. One of them I'll cover right here. Is SurvCE 2.5 available in Portuguese? Yes, that is available in several different languages, including Portuguese, and that's available from our EMEA office. Please contact them. I think you've answered the questions about the post-processing, Paul, and the exporting the vectors, and I want to just reiterate that Carlson is working on a GNSS solution, and that should be available soon. I have a comment here, Paul, about offset methods, on whether or not is there a certain one that you would recommend, and will 2-point carry over elevations?
If I go under the survey menu, I can go to O for offset, which allows me to do my offsets. Now you have different methods, different options, depending on what it is you're trying to accomplish. One of the things that we used to do, for example, when we were doing GIS surveying, we were doing utility asset location, and getting out of the car and walking up to every gas meter or water valve and shooting it, or every power pole was very time consuming. What we ended up doing is connecting a laser rangefinder that had an azimuth or a compass built into it so it could display the azimuth. We would connect the GPS receiver into one port on the data collector, the laser into the other. You drive along, you get your GPS position, and then you say, hey, I'm going to use a laser for the offset. So I lean out the window, I shoot the laser, the power pole, and now I've got a point that's computed at that offset. The nice thing is, in my coordinate file, in the CRD file, all I see is the point. Here's where it is. In the raw file, I see the offset information that was calculated. Those raw files, again, I say this 1,000 times in classes when I teach SurvCE classes, that raw file is my field book file. It's my electronic field book, essentially. And all of that good information that I should be writing is stored in there, including the case of offsets. If I did a standard offset, just said, hey, here's my current GPS position, go ahead and read my GPS position, so it gives me the position, and I tell it to offset 100 feet, I'll do a 45-degree azimuth, no vertical, I'll tell it to read again. Now I have a new position, 100 feet at a 45 degree from my current location. The elevation was the other question here, is projected. So it doesn't know what the terrain is doing. It's not going to interpolate and try to figure out what the ground is doing out there. It's a straight line projection. Okay, so I probably wouldn't do a 100-foot offset because your elevation is most likely going to be off. Okay, you have other methods. You can do intersect. So I could go out and locate 2 points and say, hey, intersect those based on the information that I've given you here. Do 2 points, so on and so forth. When I'm doing the intersect, the elevation is interpolated based on where those 2 points would intersect. But again, it's all mathematics. It's not analyzing topography and saying this is what it should be, because it doesn't have that information. So what do I do? There's no one answer here. It depends on the circumstance. It depends on what you're doing. Sometimes when you get in a pinch, you got to find the answer that works for that particular scenario.
Okay, great. Good answer, Paul. In that same respect here, we're talking a lot about vectors. One of the questions here, Paul, is are vectors stored? When vectors are stored, does the GPS time also get stored with this? And I don't recall if you answered that earlier or not.
I did, but I'll show this again because it's kind of an interesting point. Now, there's a lot of information in the GPS vectors. I am not a geodesist. I don't claim to be. I'm one of the least intelligent people that I know, so I'm not an expert here to tell you what every line by line this information is. But essentially, when I look at this inside the RW5 file, I'm seeing the base position, the deltas. Right above that, I'm seeing the date and the GPS clock time that point was started. Below that, you'll see the TM note. That is SurvCE's timestamp. That appears if you have turned the time stamping on back under the main settings. So under the File menu, Job Settings, I have to remember where it is here. It's under Option, Store GPS Accuracy, timestamp each point.
Great.
Okay, if that's turned on, that gives me this TM note, and that works for total station or GPS. Okay, and then whether that's turned on or not, the log raw vector stores that GPS clock time.
Great, great. Got one more question here, and again, this is really just an overview of SurvCE for GPS, but one of the customers here wants to see, has a question about Stakeout. Can you show a little bit of Stakeout here, Paul?
Sure. What I'll do is I'll go to the Survey menu, and I'll stake to a point. I'm simply going to stake to point number 2. That was the second one we picked up. I could key in the point number. I can go to the list of available points and select it from the list, or I can go to the screen and pick it from the screen. Now, one of the nice things that Carlson has done here, and this goes back a long time, this isn't new to 2.5, but they've given you the ability to create a list. Because maybe what I need to stake, I've got 20 points, and I need to stake point 1, point 10, point 5, point 15, point 16, point 17, and point 3 in that order. Instead of having to try to remember which one they are, I can look at the list and I can essentially say, hey, take point number 2 and add it to my point list. Okay, so that what happens is I get a full list of these points, and I would pick the one I want, start with it, and say OK. Now what that does for me is here, when I say next, it moves to the next point number in my list. Okay, so it smooths that thing out for me. So now what I'm looking at is a SurvCE screen showing all of my information about staking this point. Here's where I need to go. Here's my standard deviation. I'm staking point number 2. Here's the elevation of it. I have 1/10 of a foot of cut. I'm west of it. If I don't like how that's displayed, I can go into the configure, into the C for configure, and I can view points, and I can change the method in, out, left, right, north, south, east, west. I keep, with my GPS, I keep a pole clamp that has a compass on it, so that I always have a compass, because even though I know the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, I don't know, I still need help sometimes. Okay, so I can control how that appears. Now, one thing I'll mention here as well, SNMC, I'm seeing text. Some of you in newer versions of SurvCE aren't seeing text. You're seeing icons. Older version of SurvCE, it was text only. Okay, to make the program more universal, icons were added in 2.0. If I'm seeing icons and I don't want icons, then I'm going to go over here to the map screen, and I'm going to go to my view and view options. Oh, nope, I'm wrong. It's not there. Let me go back under my store points to remember where this is now. Trail, data, intelligent zoom. Uh-oh. Where have you gone on me? Maybe it's here under configure. Yeah. Under the configure, use graphic icons in survey. So if that's turned on, I'm going to see icons. If I go back into that and turn it off, now I have the text. So if yours looks a little different than mine here, that's why you're seeing that, that little setting. Now, as far as the staking goes, like Dave said, the stakeout wasn't the intention of this. I think we've got some seminars and things coming up that involve staking and stakeout, and we can go more in depth into that. I can say that SurvCE gives you dozens of options for staking to grids, staking to center lines, staking to imaginary lines, staking to whatever you want to stake, surfaces, DXF files. I could go into the map screen and do a file, DXF or DWG import, okay, shape file, so on and so forth. But again, that's something I want to do another time. I don't want to bog this one down with staking options, but you do have a lot of options there for staking. If you want to discuss those more, send me an email, info@carlsonds.com. Go to the website. Whatever you want to do, get in touch with me. I'll be happy to address those. You may even find the answers on our website, carlsonds.com. Like I said, there are videos, there are documents, there's all kinds of information out there for your consumption. The videos are, again, in the blog as well, and some of them make it in the newsletter. So all that information is out there for your consumption, and hopefully there's something there that is of use.
All right, great. Thanks, Paul. That's it for the questions. Thank you all for participating in today's webinar. We appreciate your questions and comments. Excellent job, Paul. Next week, Paul's going to be hosting our webinar, and we're going to be working with DEM files, so we hope you can join us. Again, if you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to contact myself or Paul Carlson at the information provided there on the screen. Thank you again.